stop to that. Hopefully it will stop now. Can you please start with your statement and tell the Commission something about yourself?
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. This is the statement to the Commission of Inquiry into the Public Investment Corporation. I, the undersigned Sibusisiwe Nkosinomusa Zulu, do hereby state that I'm a major female and former non-executive director of the Public Investment Corporation. I provide this statement voluntarily, having been requested by the evidence leader of the Commission to do so. I further confirm that the contents of the statement are true and correct. I hold a Bachelor of Law degree from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, a postgraduate diploma in corporate law from the University of Johannesburg, and an advanced certificate in business rescue from the University of South Africa. I was admitted as an advocate of the High Court in 2005. A few months later, I elected to join the corporate world, where I worked as a legal advisor and an assistant compliance officer for Itala Development Finance Corporation, which is a KZN provincial development finance institution. In 2008, I decided to go back to my passion, which is practicing law. I then served my articles for a period of 1 year whilst doing my practical legal training course under attorney John Wills, who's a human rights lawyer and had practiced for more than 20 years. After being admitted as an attorney, John Wills offered me partnership. It was at that point that the firm which I remain a director of, Ngubane Wills Incorporated, was formed. I was appointed to the PIC board in October 2015, but resumed my duties at the end of January 2016. My term ended on the 1st of February 2019, when we resigned as the board pending the minister appointing a new board, which occurred on the 12th of July 2019. During my period at the PIC, I was a member of the following subcommittees: Audit and Risk, Social and Ethics, and the Investment Committee. I was also a member of the Property Investment and the Social, Economic, Infrastructure, and Environmental Sustainability Fund Investment Panel, which are subcommittees of the Investment Committee. I was asked by the evidence leader to deal with the allegations leveled against me, which implicated myself and my fellow directors of impropriety. I will then respond to any clarity-seeking questions that the Commission may have. Before I do so, it is worth mentioning that in all instances, all the work of the PIC that I was part of took place through recorded meetings, and there are minutes, transcripts, submissions pertaining to those activities. Hence, I've elected not to burden the Commission with regurgitation. I now move to the allegations leveled against me by James Nogu. I wish to categorically state that the allegations of impropriety and malfeasance made by an unknown source called James Nogu against myself and my fellow directors are untrue, unfounded, and not supported by any facts. On the 29th of January 2019, when the email with these allegations was publicly circulated, I immediately requested the board to institute an independent investigation. My instant view was that if these allegations were not dealt with independently and urgently, they had a potential of disrupting the workings of the PIC and destabilize the PIC as an institution, whilst tainting the credibility of its board. We had experienced this in 2017 when allegations were made by the very same James Nogu against other directors. When Nogu resurfaced in January 2019, it became clear to me that if these allegations were not investigated, they would have a damaging effect on our reputations and integrity, not only as PIC directors, but as individuals who have a professional life even outside of the PIC. I was thus pleased that on the 1st of February 2019, 2 days after I had made this urgent request to the board, a special board meeting was convened by the chairman, Mr. Mondli Gungubele, to deal with this James Nogu email, and my request for an investigation to be instituted. The board accordingly resolved that an independent investigation to be led by a reputable senior counsel, supported by forensic auditors and any other experts required, be instituted. The timeline anticipated by the board, based on previous similar investigations, was a period of approximately 1 month. We therefore expected the final investigation report to be released in March 2019, and this was going to be submitted to the Minister of Finance as the shareholder representative and also to this Honorable Commission. This was a big relief for me because I knew that the James Nogu allegations were going to disable me from pursuing some of my professional commitments because they contaminated the fit and proper standard that one requires to hold positions of trust. Sadly, what was to be a month's wait has dragged to 6 months. It became apparent that since this investigation was now handed over to the Commission at its request, we had to wait for the Commission to conclude its work. I must emphasize, I do not in any way blame the Commission for this, because I'm mindful of the enormous task that it faces. Our investigation is just one of many. However, at a personal level, this has been an agonizing period. Because of this unknown James Nogu, we have been subjected to inaccurate media reports and slanderous social media posts with the narrative that we are corrupt and siphoned hundreds of millions of pensioners' funds. It is my respectful view that a reasonable person with basic knowledge of PIC processes will understand that these allegations of corruption and impropriety against my colleagues and I contained in the James Nogu emails are completely illogical and balderdash. Our families have also been negatively impacted and humiliated by this. To give an example, a month ago, while I was being investigated by the Commission, I was suddenly informed that it had received a report from a whistleblower that I have used my mother's bank accounts to hide the corrupt income that I had received. My entire family was distressed by this. We nevertheless consented to a full probe into my mother's financial affairs and handed over all her personal information required for the investigation. To date, we do not know where these bogus allegations emanated from, but it has been interesting to watch the tactics grow from a concerted effort to discredit me to a low blow of kicking me where it matters most, my family. I'm forever indebted to my parents that despite the trauma and pain that they themselves have had to endure because of this ordeal, they've stood by me, encouraged me, cheered me on, even when I was debilitated. It is against this background that I now come to the Commission to plead that we be given an opportunity to to move on and rebuild our professional lives. This by no way means if there are findings of corruption, irregularity, and impropriety committed at the PIC that these must be swept under the carpet. But I'm more than confident that in my 4 years of service at the PIC, I acted lawfully and ethically. I therefore do not believe that commitment to the PIC over the years should be rewarded with a dented reputation and an impaired career. We therefore ask the Commission that the Commission assists us in publicly setting the record straight and formally making findings on these James Noku allegations. And at the risk of coming out as putting under pressure on the Commission, it must be borne in mind that for us, it has been a 6 months of serious prejudice. Now that the Commission's term has been extended to October, we humbly request that this James Noku matter be dealt with and concluded sooner. I'm aware that even my other colleagues who were James Noku targets share this sentiment. And I know this because we had these discussions in some of our board meetings. Mr. Commissioner, I would like to now move on to the functioning of the board in general. I want to unambiguously state my view that I, together with my colleagues who were non-executive directors, served the PIC with dignity and integrity. We offered our skills and knowledge. We acted in good faith and were fully committed to good governance, to grow and protect our clients' assets. We did our level best to contribute to taking the PIC to greater heights. This by no way means we were a perfect board and that all our decisions were quintessential. But I believe that at all times we acted in good faith, even when we differed. The robustness and vibrancy in our meetings made sure that none of us stepped into that boardroom ill-prepared. We read, we researched, vigorously debated all matters put before us. Mr. Commissioner, I want to respectfully submit that even our differing views and or positions on matters were a clear illustration of the independence and activeness of directors. In my view, we acted without any fear or favor. We endeavored to make decisions which we believed were in the best interest of the PIC and also our clients whom we invest on behalf. I must highlight that in the 4 years of being at the PIC, there are only 2 issues that divided the board. Firstly, it was the handling of the allegations against the former CEO, Dr. Daniel Matjila. Whether the board could exonerate him without allowing for an independent process to take place or not. In my view, this matter reached its finality when former Minister Nene formally expressed his disagreement with the board's position not to investigate and issued a directive that these allegations be independently investigated. It is also common cause that this matter had attracted a lot of public interest. Hence, the minister exercised his powers as envisaged in Section 6(4) of the PIC Act. The second issue that divided the board was whether the disciplinary actions taken against some employees based on the James Noku saga, dating back as far as 2017, were reasonable, justified, fair, and independent, or could be viewed as victimization of staff. Again, this matter was concluded by the board. We resolved that Ms. Menye and Ms. Matebula must be reinstated. The only complication with Ms. Menye's process was that a settlement amount had been paid to her, and we obtained a legal opinion that stated that this settlement agreement entered into and subsequently the payment made to her were irregular. The board therefore resolved to seek guidance from National Treasury on how to ensure that her reinstatement process complies with the PFMA and all applicable Treasury regulations. Management, led by the acting CEO, Mr. Vuyani Haku, was then tasked to facilitate this process. These were solely the two matters that caused us to even be labeled as a divided board with factions. As I conclude the statement, I would be failing if I do not use this opportunity to acknowledge and express gratitude to the PIC jewel, the most important has remained asset manager because of these resilient and world-class employees. For that, we thank them, and in instances where they may have felt that we as the board was not paying attention to issues that mattered to them, we profusely apologize. That is my statement, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Mrs. Zulu, I'd like to discuss some topics in your statement with you. And let me start with your conclusion. You talk of a new culture of transparency and teamwork and the bottom-up approach. Do I understand correctly that that is something that was lacking previously?
Mr. Commissioner, some of these matters could be real or perceived in my view. But we cannot run away from the fact that the PIC had that reputation out there in general, that we are arrogant, we need to be able to get to the top guys to be attended to. And we felt that as the board, with everything that was happening and the direct spotlight, it gave us a challenge to say, how do we then deal with the culture? I want to submit that my view with the PIC is not necessarily that the systems are dysfunctional. The PIC has got quite functional systems, and the governance structures do exist. But the culture in my view, appeared to be the issue. And that's what caused a lot of discomfort even with employees, or that element of fear of not knowing what to do when, or to wait to get approvals from the top. And those are things that we can't run away because they were there and they were being discussed, whether real or perceived, but they were there. And therefore, to give an example, one of the resolutions that the board had taken earlier on this year was that when transactions come in, the deal screening committee should not necessarily involve senior management, but it should be the deal team that debates and thrashes out a transaction until they get to a point where they say they are comfortable with the transaction to take it up to the next committee. So we consciously removed, because previously the deal screening committee still had the CEO, the CFO, and other executives. But we said, let what is seen as junior staff participate, because ultimately they must also take accountability in the processes. So that culture, I know there was even a joke at the PIC that now you're taking back power to the people because of that culture. And the fund principals and the deal teams were quite excited because they were now taking full ownership. So they could actually even kill a deal if they don't believe in it at that level without fearing any threats or intimidation.
You have spent some time in the corporate world and you've been part of the PIC for 4 years as you've testified. In your experience, who sets the culture in an organization?
The board definitely, being the accounting authority of an institution, has a responsibility to set the culture. I think in retrospect, having seen what we've gone through at the PIC in a couple of months, there was a lot of reliance when it comes to some of these matters where we would say as the board, actually, we've delegated that authority to management. Your classic example is the employee relations matters. For example, the matter of Miss Menye, I actually got to know about it, when I was reading the business day coming to a meeting at the PIC, that she had been settled, and at the time they were saying she was settled for 7 million, but the board did not have that information. What was interesting is that when we got to the meeting, out of interest, obviously being a director, is this true? And I got to interact with the executive head of human resources, and I said, Mr. Polwane, I just picked up on this. Is this article true? This can't be true. We know nothing about this. Is there? And he said to me, well, the agreement entered into is confidential, and I'm not allowed to disclose it. Now, that is basically, I think, the culture which as the board we need to, I think as a former director, I take responsibility for, to say we had allowed for that culture to settle in. I know a fellow director was standing next to me. We actually looked at each other, and that was the end of the conversation, until we looked at the matter literally only this year. But he said the agreement was between the CEO and the concerned employee, and it's confidential, and no one is supposed to know its content. So perhaps certain things did fall through the cracks in us fully relying on the delegations of authority and saying certain things must be done by management, and we will not take responsibility therefore.
What became very interesting for me over the many days we sat in this commission is that a single board member or senior manager testified about a toxic situation in the PIC, about fear and victimization of employees. Whilst on the other hand, the junior employees, middle and senior junior employees talked about the victimization, the fear, the culture of victimization and fear in this organization. And so much so that for the first time in the history of this organization, they had to form a union to protect themselves. Can you comment on that?
That is correct, Mr. Commissioner. And I don't believe that we completely turned a blind eye on those matters as the board, but I believe that we gave and had too much reliance on management. And anyone who, understands corporate governance will tell you that when people feel you're starting to question the authority delegated to them, they'll go as far as saying you are interfering. But ultimately, my understanding is that the buck, so to speak, stops with the board as the accounting authority. So the board is allowed to question anything that may not be in the interest of the institution. And I think that's why in my statement I was saying, in the past few months, my view is that that culture started settling in. And you could see even the attitude of employees, because matters that also mattered to them, issues that mattered to them, were being dealt with by the board.
If I can take you back to your response to the settlement of Ms. Mendy. My understanding is that you were told by the executive head of HR, it's a confidential agreement and you as a board member are not allowed to be privy to that. My view of that, and I'd like your comment, is that it is not only unacceptable, it's arrogant.
Well, it was during, Mr. Commissioner, it was literally during a break. We're having a board meeting on the day, and I just asked informally, and it just so happens that one of the directors were there. And the minute he said, well, and it was almost like he was making it clear that this is an agreement between the CEO and the concerned employee, and the matter ends there. It's been accepted, it's signed and sealed. Obviously, in retrospect, I think one should have probed more. And this is exactly what happened, what the board subsequently did this year, earlier on this year. We received a report which gave us an update on all these employee relations matters. And for the first time, we actually demanded to see the settlement agreement. We had never seen it as the board until January 2019. And my understanding is that that settlement was in 2018, sometime early 2018. And we demanded to see the settlement agreement, and it was made available to us. When we read some of the clauses in that agreement, personally, I was flabbergasted. And it goes back to, in retrospect, we should have done that earlier. And that's when we said, we need to get a legal opinion, because firstly, we found it very strange that the settlement agreement had been signed by the head of HR. And our understanding was that such an agreement should have been signed by the CEO. When an inquiry was then made, there was an indication that the authority had been delegated. But we subsequently learned that there was no such anything, there was nothing in writing to that effect. And that's what really made the actual agreement irregular, because at the time, Mr. Kulwane did not have powers to sign the said agreement. So it does confirm that even when authority has been delegated by the board, Mr. Commissioner, the board must still remain vigilant. It must look into matters and be entitled to have access to any documentation should it be in the interest of the board to actually look into such matters.
Now, thank you for that. Can I just get back to the two ladies that were reinstated? In the case of Ms. Menye, I understand there was no disciplinary hearing. In the course of proceedings, there was a settlement reached and she was paid out. And that was the end of the matter. But in the case of Mrs. Matabula, she went through the disciplinary process, she was found guilty and dismissed. On what grounds, can you share that with the Commission, did the board decide to reinstate?
Mr. Commissioner, I think the background is important, and that's why in my statement I say that the institution of such disciplinary hearing, was it fair? Was it reasonable? Was it justified? Because the background then becomes important. Because when we actually, so we didn't look at the charges per se, but we had to take into account the circumstances which those charges had arisen under. And the majority of the board felt very strongly that this started as this big James Nogu issue within the institution, and then at the time, the board says the CEO must look into, because there were allegations that the IT systems had been hacked and intercepted. So the board resolution was mainly concerned about the hacking and interception of our IT systems. Now we learned months later that some of the activities that actually took place were beyond just that. Obviously also there was a concern about the leakages that were taking place. But we then discovered, for example, at the time, at that time, it all revolved around the issue of IT systems at the PIC being hacked, and therefore you have a James Snow. were made. And when you look at the report, it clearly states that there were certain actions taken by our employees which were not in line with normal governance processes and could be found to be irregular. And our view, and the record of that meeting will actually bear me out. We actually felt that there were employees that could have acted under pressure. They didn't know what to do. There is just to give an example, Mr. Commissioner, there is a lady by the name of, I think it's Ganelo Adams. Yes. Yes. What she does is she's told to liquidate. And she's told this transaction is going ahead. She is apparently called into an office, because she says, well, I need to be told by the powers that be that I must do this. After being told, she still insists, send me an email. I'm not going to move without an email. Now you can easily draw an inference there that some of these employees had to make a choice between doing the right thing and running a risk of being charged with insubordination, or see how far they can go with what they viewed as irregular outside of the normal PIC processes. So you could tell that, just from the reading of the report, when we sat in that boardroom, we said, this is a movie. You can tell what each character did here, and you can draw an inference from these. And Mr. Commissioner, it's very important to highlight that our view, because I know there was that view that the board is now further victimizing employees. We said that these are professionals in their own right, and they need to be given an opportunity to actually account for this. Now, we were not going to call them in one by one as the board and say, well, account, what did you do? But we said, let them go through a formal process, because when you subject them to that, they will actually even disclose further information, because they understand that their professions and their careers are on the line here. So they will actually tell you more than what they may have disclosed even during the investigation. And we've seen that. And I know when, in the past couple of months, we had actually procured services of an independent firm just to facilitate the process, and they had given us advice to say, with some of these employees, we will take them through an informal process. Just so that we say, listen, do you realize that what you did here was not, within the PIC process, in line with PIC processes, and therefore, these are the implications. So we had agreed that that process must actually take place. And so I'm not sure where it is now, but that is what was actually happening when I left the PIC.
We'll come back to the AO transaction, but I think, to be fair to you, let me put my view to you and what is my concern about this process, whether it is fair or it is victimization. It seems to me what happened is that the PIC was hauled before the Parliamentary Committee, SCOPA, about this transaction. There were pressures put on the PIC. Why didn't you act against people that transgressed in the AO transaction? Then there was a sudden, I would call it, a rush investigation by internal audit, who's not qualified to do these type of investigations, with an absolute superfluous report, not knowing or not telling the board that, according to Dr. Machila and everybody else, that if you sign an irrevocable offer before a meeting and a disbursement memo, that's a done deal. The board was not informed of that. SCOPA was not informed of that. But after the internal audit report, there's a media statement by the board that procedures were flouted by the PIC. That, to me, seems inherently unfair. But it's my view. I'm not saying I'm correct. I'd like your view on that.
Perhaps the background is also important, that when we appeared before SCOPA in December 2018, SCOPA had asked us to deal with a number of transactions. So we had the reports. We had seen them as the board. And we even had a report on this very IO transaction. And when the parliamentarians started asking specific questions on IO, there's information that had not been disclosed at any point previously that actually came out. And the recording, I'm certain because the meetings of SCOPA are recorded, it will show that. In fact, when the executive head of listed is pressed for a response, Mr. Fidelis Madavu, he ultimately conceded, and this is on record, he conceded that there may have been irregularity insofar as the IO transaction is concerned. And that's on record. Now, sitting there as an as a non-executive director, you are bound to be taken aback because it goes against the information that you already sit with at the time.
I'm sorry to interrupt you because I want this to tie in with your answer. In terms of your statement, you sat on the Audit and Risk Committee.
That's correct.
And also on the Investment Committee.
That's correct.
The IO transaction was brought to the Audit and Risk Committee.
Yeah, that's
and
correct.
And it was brought
Mr.
to the Invest Committee.
That's correct, Mr.
Am I correct to say that at no stage was it disclosed to these committees that an irrevocable offer was signed before the meeting?
As far as my knowledge is concerned, I do not recall such a disclosure being made. I've had the benefit of actually going back to the documents that were given to the IC because the Audit and Risk Committee felt that because the matter is already being looked into by the IC, it will not deal with it. It will wait for the report to come from the IC, and then they would basically then make a decision based on that report.
And I suppose as a legally trained person, you will agree with me that that fact was not only relevant, it's the most crucial fact in the whole saga of the IO transaction.
It is the crucial fact. Maybe just to go back a bit, Mr. Commissioner, what actually happened, because when we had the IC meeting, that's when internal audit had raised a finding, and that's very important to emphasize, because a question has arisen that why did internal audit just raise a light finding then and then later come up with a full report? That was a finding done in their normal course of the business. So they basically, just like the Auditor General would conduct, an audit in an institution, and then later on you hear that a full forensic investigation has been conducted, and certain issues that even the AG may not have picked up have been picked up through an investigation. So that's very important to actually differentiate, because when internal audit came, they were just presenting a finding, which they came across when they were doing their normal audit work. Now, when information comes up at SCOPA, it then became the responsibility of the board to actually say, we want this matter to be looked into in detail, thoroughly, because it appears that we may not have all the factual background in relation to this matter. And that's what happened there. Because in the meeting, in the IC meeting, it was, oh, here's a finding. And remember, with an audit finding, management needs to say, how do you rectify this finding? And that's confirmed, internal audit accepts, and that's the end of the matter. But the investigation then implicates a number of employees. This is what it was. This is what actually happened. This was the process. Certain things were signed, without the necessary approvals. So it gives you that full background now, and that was the benefit of the work and the investigation which was done by internal audit. And I think, Mr. Commissioner, I must also emphasize, this was not a forensic investigation per se, simply because you had documentary evidence, but you also had employees who had participated, therefore gave, evidence verbally to say this was my participation. So what internal audit did, they interviewed everybody who had been part of the transaction, and they re-looked into the documents. So there was no question around the credibility of the investigation per se, because it was supported by the said employees together with the documents that had been put together.
My concern is, especially at an institution like the PIC, what internal audit should have done and picked up right from the start is that due process was not followed. That irrevocable offer was signed. It was clear, that all the facts are there, the documents are there, that the disbursement memo was signed, and they should have reported on that. Not just, as you say, a light-hearted type of audit query raised by internal. They should have done that initially.
Mr. Commissioner, while I accept that, I think it's very important, it must also be borne in mind that exactly the example that I just made with the Auditor General, sometimes there are findings that they'll make or certain things, and we've seen this with some of the parastatals, where an investigation is done at a later stage and an institution had received a clean audit, And sometimes, and because it's based on the testing that they do, so they don't basically investigate everything. They test, they conduct an audit on specific areas, and they will pick up certain things. So in this instance, my view is that they picked up an element which they immediately presented to management, and management said, don't worry, we'll take care of this, we'll rectify it. But at a later stage, when they are asked to then conduct an investigation, they then uncover a lot of detail. And I think, in my view, they did do their job in this instance properly.
Apart from disclosing to the Audit and Risk Committee and the Investment Committee the crucial fact of an irrevocable offer signed before the meeting. That was not disclosed.
The irrevocable offer, that information, Mr. Commissioner, is what was disclosed through the investigation in January. At the time, they had looked at a meeting which supposedly approved what needed to be ratified. So that's what they had done. That was their finding in 2017, that there was an approval instead of a ratification. And management said, oh, we'll hold a special meeting or a round robin to ratify, and it closed the matter. But when looking further and in detail into some of these matters, that's when they then uncovered the details.
I'm not going to dwell on this longer, and it's not your concern, but it is a matter of grave concern for me that senior people in the PIC, like the CEO and the CFO, apparently does not understand the difference between approval and ratification. But be that as it may, can I then deal briefly with you?
I suppose, Advocate Luba, one doesn't really know. We haven't made any finding, of course, as to whether what they say is true. But
Mr. Commissioner, that is correct, but the undisputed facts are that an irrevocable offer was signed on the 14th of December. A disbursement memo was signed by the CFO, which only can mean, there can be no other meaning, that it's a done deal. And that can only be ratified, cannot be approved. And that's where it seems to me.
All I'm saying is that we still have to make a finding on that, because insofar as Dr. Machila is concerned, his evidence is, well, to me it's the same, means the same thing.
Yes. Which is,
Whether that is so or not,
which
that
is
he
also
didn't
surprising.
really know, is a matter for us to decide.
I'm in full agreement with you, Mr. Commissioner. Can we then briefly deal with board meetings? And some of these directors have described you as a tough debater at these meetings. Is that correct? You stand your ground.
Mr. Commissioner, I think, well, this is my view. I was not just the only director that stood her ground.
Meaning that the answer is yes, I stood my ground.
Oh, yes, indeed, Mr. Commissioner, I did stand my ground.
Well, can I mention the example? I'm sorry to interrupt you. The whole issue of the Pretty Low saga and Dr. Machila and the majority of the board changing their decision, and you stood up and said, no, I disagree and I want my vote to be recorded. That's how you argue. Is that right?
That's correct, Mr. Commissioner. And it's not anything unusual. We do it all the time at the PIC. Well, in fact, when you don't agree with a decision, you would actually ask for your dissenting view to be recorded. So it was nothing unusual, and it's a clear illustration of a director's exercise of their fiduciary duty. So you basically don't get into board meetings to rubber stamp what the majority says, even if you do not agree, but you exercise your views independently or your duties, and you do so independently with care and skill.
Can I ask you, this email of Noku implicating you, did you view it as a whistleblower?
So generally when these emails, Mr. Commissioner, not even just to deal with my email per se, but all of these emails, when they come through, my view was that we need to actually look at the impact that they will have on the institution. And how you then, and that will then inform how you then deal with them. And the 2017 email is a classic example where we as the board, because that was basically our decision ultimately, which I was part of, you know, when we as the board said we will not deal with this matter, and we publicly declared that we have confidence in our CEO, we disregard these, that literally initiated our nightmares at the PIC. It destabilized the institution. Emails kept coming through. The media took interest in these matters. We were taken to court. There were even allegations that we were covering up for the CEO. And Mr. Commissioner, I actually was not even physically present in the meeting, in that specific meeting. So I had not, when I received these emails and then I was told there's going to be a special board meeting to deal with this, my immediate reaction was, well, we need to protect the PIC. We need to protect our CEO. And the best way to do so is to actually subject these allegations to an independent process. And we couldn't come as his fellow directors at the time and say, now, and I remember saying this telephonically to say, colleagues, are we going to sit here and say, Dr. Dan, is pretty low yours or not? Dr. Dan, did you? And I said, we can't do that. We basically cannot be investigators, prosecutors, and ultimately the judge to actually now say, well, we think he's not guilty. But to protect him, let's take this piece of paper, let someone independent look into it, investigate it, and then bring it back and say, well, there's nothing to it. Now, the only thing that we did, in my view, what was unfortunate, is that what we could have actually done in 2017, we ultimately had to be told to do it by the minister more than a year later. And there was a report, and we could have done that in 2017. The matter would have been closed then, and we would have come out publicly and said, we received this. Our view is that these are mischievous emails. We have confidence in our CEO. The report clears them. And it would have been independent. And no one would have raised questions around, oh, the board is actually protecting its CEO.
If we can conclude on this. So I understand your view to be that even if it's something illogical or balderdash, as you call it, like in your instance, again, the correct way to handle it is to put it to an independent investigation and get a report. Is that correct?
As part of protecting an institution and its leadership, we need to be prepared to be subjected to being questioned, to being investigated. In fact, I strongly believe that once you've undergone that process, it's easy to deal with whatever else that's illogical that comes thereafter, because you will say, well, we know these things, and we've dealt with them properly, and this is the process to follow, and you close it at that. And I think it was a missed opportunity in this instance for us to do so. Hence my attitude and approach that when I received this email, in 2019 now from James Nogu, my view was, colleagues, let's take it through an independent process. In fact, it's in my interest as a professional to make sure that it goes through that process.
I apologize to you that it took so long for us to conclude on it. But as I've informed you that it has now been concluded, the lifestyle audits were handed up to the Commission, and there is no substance in the allegations levelled against you in the Noku email.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Just to conclude on the board matters, there was severe criticism levelled at the previous chair, Mr. Mondli Gugumbelu, about what he did in the General Holomisa court application, where he didn't side with the majority of the board, but filed his own opposing affidavit. Can you just briefly comment on that, how you see it?
So we received court papers, and as Mr. Commissioner, you are aware now, and they had cited the board, the former CEO, the chairperson of the board, the minister, yes, and the minister as respondents. Yes, I've mentioned the CEO. And what then happened was, even before receiving those papers, the minister had requested the board to explain itself. This was Minister Nhlanhla Nene. He had written to us to say, well, there are subpoenas, this thing is all over the media. I hear, police are involved now, they're investigating. Can the board tell me what is going on? And we put together documentation for him through management, and we submitted those. That was actually the very first meeting we had with Chairman Gungubele. He then, the other issue was that he had also received a subpoena. And he then said, colleagues, I don't know what I'm supposed to give. I don't know any of these matters. And clearly, the minister's taken interest. I need to be taken through these matters. And so he then requested that he does not respond to the subpoena, and that was done through our lawyers, where they wrote to the police to say, the chairman is new, and can he be given an opportunity to try and familiarize himself with these issues? Then the documents were given to the minister at the time. Then the chair called a meeting with the board, and our understanding at the time was that the minister was asking specific questions. So he was saying, why have you not investigated this? Why did the board make this decision? Insofar as employee matters are concerned, why was this employee investigated? Why were they taken through a disciplinary process? Those are matters he had no background of. And frankly, at the time, even the board, insofar as the employee relation matters were concerned, we did not have much of a background. He then convened a special board meeting. And then at that meeting, he said, I'm one of you, I'm a director, just take me through these matters. I've gone through these documents, and I want to express my view. And Mr. Commissioner, for me, that's very important, because it goes back to the issue that when you are in that boardroom, what is your view? You can't, in as much as ultimately you are bound by the board decision, but what is your view? And that is exactly what happened. So a discussion took place in that boardroom. And he then expressed his view. He said, well, I don't agree with the decision of the board. It makes me uncomfortable. And in the process, the minister has been dragged into these matters. And he just basically took us, and there's a record to that effect, so I don't need to repeat everything he said in the meeting. And he was asking specific questions. Did the board take this matter into account? Was this factor taken into account, etc.? And that's what happened. Now, when the papers were then served on the board. The court papers were then served. He then said, the board then resolved, and there's a resolution to that effect, and obviously recordings to that effect. The board then said, we understand that the CEO, in as much as he's a director, has been cited as a respondent, and the chairperson has also been cited. The board then accordingly resolved that should they want to oppose this application independently, they should be allowed to do so. And that is and there's a resolution to that effect. And the board approved that. We said procurement processes must be followed. This is an urgent matter. And then the board, which was part of the decision, which understands the process, because remember, even the CEO at the time had not been part of some of those meetings. He had actually been excused from those meetings. Now, we said that's why he must basically state his background independently. And the chairman had expressed a strong view to the board, but he also said that he will not necessarily oppose the application. He'll abide by the decision of the court. But it's important for him to actually say, well, I came in a month ago, and this is what I understand these matters to be. So that's what happened insofar as the chairman is concerned.
Thank you. Another issue that I want you to comment on, please, is there were allegations that there were tampering with board minutes. Whilst you were on that board, can you tell the Commission, is that true or not?
Mr. Commissioner, once again, in retrospect, because we learned this afterwards, during that NOKU, the first NOKU, the 2017 NOKU, if I may be allowed to call it, period, those meetings were not recorded. And so the company secretary was basically, writing down everything that each director was saying at that meeting.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. The evidence under oath by Ms. Matabula was that it was a board's decision,
Yes,
not to record in-camera meetings.
that's very correct. The board at that time said these meetings must not be recorded, and the reasoning was that, well, there are a number of leakages, and our systems are being hacked, etc. So it was just that culture of fear and discomfort and an element of distrust because documents are going all over. Therefore, the meeting wasn't recorded. And the reasoning was that, well, this relates to the CEO. In hindsight, that was a wrong decision because we then deprived any interested party, including this commission, to actually really listen to the recording or go through the transcript of really what happened in the meeting. Now, the company secretary obviously had to literally take everything down that the board was saying. And so there was a set of minutes which was circulated to the board. And the board made comments, and I think there was a second set of minutes. But ultimately, when a board meeting took place to adopt the minutes, the board felt strongly that there was just too much content on those minutes. They were ugly minutes, Mr. Commissioner, so to speak. And so the board felt that some of the issues must be removed and focus on the resolutions taken. So it was actually, I think, about 2 or 3 sets of minutes which contained a lot of content, a lot of information, the true deliberations that had taken place at the in the meeting, and then ultimately the set which was adopted was the sanitized, cleaned up version, so to speak, of the minutes, to say, let's keep it simple, let's keep it clean, capture what the discussion was about in brief, and then say what the resolutions were.
Do I understand your answer correctly? There was nothing dishonest about it.
Well, when we did it at the time, of course, there was nothing dishonest about it. In hindsight, we did miss out on a lot of content, especially because those matters attracted a lot of public, interest.
But it's minutes adopted by the board, as their minutes.
That's correct, Mr. Commissioner.
It was not a case of somebody going behind the door and cut and paste and change the minutes.
Not at all, Mr. Commissioner.
I'm taking up too much time. I think there's some questions from the Commissioner as well. Can I just ask you?
Feel free to go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Briefly, what was your relationship with Dr. Machila? Was it initially good? Was there bad blood? Can you just briefly tell us about it?
It was a professional relationship. I have a lot of respect for Dr. Machila, Mr. Commissioner. Having a lot of respect for someone does not mean you'll agree with every decision they make. I think he's a brilliant mathematician, a solid investment banker, and added a lot of value at the PIC, played a critical role. But like I said, that doesn't mean you question decisions. You will not question decisions. Hence, the president himself gets questioned. So, being in a significant or powerful position, in my view, does not necessarily mean then that you cannot be questioned. So that remains my position. I think Dr. Machila, and even when he left the PIC, all of us in the boardroom expressed that view, to say he has contributed significantly to the PIC. In fact, one of Dr. Machila's achievements, Mr. Commissioner, in my view, and this would stand out for me as a young black female. Mr. Machila had an eye for young black talent. He got the best professionals in the market to actually join the PIC. And he gave them, a chance. And for me, that must be acknowledged. And that is why then it's unfortunate that after such an achievement, those same employees would actually feel that they were victimized, the environment and the culture changed and became one of fear, of not operating properly, and that for me was very unfortunate. And that is why I was saying that it is the culture more than anything at the PIC that needs to be changed. You would literally hear that, and I think it was Ms. Menya that gave this evidence. I mean, it was literally something that employees would laugh about or share, to say, phew, sometimes when you go to the 7th floor, you get told, this is my institution. But I mean, there was never a formal complaint which the board ever received. It was just that there's this culture of fear and an element of the environment being unhealthy for employees, them not comfortably voicing out their opinions. To give an example where I actually picked this culture up in a meeting, in an investment committee meeting, Mr. Commissioner, we're having a property investment meeting, and there was a transaction. It's somewhere in your list, Mr. Lube. And the transaction was just wrong in every way, in every sense. And I kept asking one question. So I went past the point of saying, I don't like this transaction, we will never invest here. I wanted to find out one thing. Risk, how did you put together this report? Legal, how did you, and everyone just kept quiet and they were just looking, at the CEO hoping he'll rescue them. And you could pick up. And afterwards, I said to these guys, during breaking, we said, but why are you messing up your careers? Why would you actually support a transaction that is not good for the institution? Months later, when the transaction came out in public, the executive head of that unit, when we came to the PIC, actually said, oh, Ms. Zulu, thank you. You rescued us. Where would we be? Now,
I would prefer identification of these figures. And
Mr.
these figures, these people, and the executive head that you're talking about, for instance, as well as the transaction. Which one is it? You say it's in Advocate Lube's list. Which one is it?
Mr. Commissioner, may I request that you permit me to give that information to Advocate Lube? For one reason, the employee, I would not want to spring out names of employees just, with them not being aware. I think they deserve a certain level of protection, but I surely will share the details of that transaction with the Commission. May I be allowed to do so?
But what is the problem in telling us what the transaction is?
So the transaction I can mention. If you, as you are aware, Mr. Commissioner, the initial investment that took place there was the transaction which you are aware of is the S&S refineries transaction. But there was a second transaction in 2016 where the PIC was being asked to acquire the property, so the immovable property, the plant, and S&S was going to now lease that property. And my question was, so we're literally taking over this white elephant. That's one. This, where we currently invested, that investment is not performing. So how are they going to pay the rent? Number three, are we not just stealing from Paul to pay Peter here? Because by then the loan was already impaired, and my view was this is an opportunity for SNS to take the money and just pay the other loan. Remember, there are Chinese wall within the PIC. So they could have easily paid, we buy this property, they default on their rent, and then what do we do with this huge plant in Mozambique, And so that was insofar as the investment case was concerned. But I went past that because I said, colleagues, we're not going to do this. I told my fellow directors, they said, well, maybe let's give it, and said, we're not going to do this. And that's where we stand firm as directors and we express our views freely. But I went past that and I said, I want the deal team to explain to me how this got here, And so it ended up being, because they didn't have responses, the CEO himself had to try and defend the transaction and justify, etc. But like I said, when it came out in the newspapers, the executive head called, and said, thank you, you rescued us. So it goes back to whether it's real or perceived, but there were those elements that would make one, I can make a number of those examples where, one knew that the culture of fear had set in at the PIC.
That is where you experienced it. Is that correct? When you started questioning risk and legal on their reports, everybody kept quiet.
That's correct. I mean, they had prepared their reports. Now, I went through the reports and I said, but, so you got that sense, in some of those matters that there is that element of, I need to do things in a specific way, I need to comply, I can't say no to this. But remember, we never had the benefit of what happened behind the scenes. So you could question what was put before you.
Was Dr. Machila and Ms. Mori at that meeting?
I'm not sure about Ms. Mori. I know Dr. Machila was at that meeting. In fact, because I was requesting that the committee declines the transaction, Dr. Machila then requested that it's not declined and it's put on hold so that they do more work and deal with whatever issues. And I was comfortable with that. So there was not any, outside of the professional relationship, between myself and, Dr. Dan, there was just never any issue.
Can I just ask if you are aware that the S&S transaction went ahead?
The property one?
The oil one, the Mozambique one went ahead.
Yes, no, there were two
I
transactions.
understand that, but what I'm
Yes.
saying, because you've implied from the way you've presented it that the deal was stopped, and you've just said the decline, is that relating to the property deal, knowing that the S&S investment went ahead?
Yes, the property S&S investment
Did
was
not
put on
go
hold,
ahead.
yes.
And it never went ahead?
As far as my
As you
knowledge is
know.
concerned, Ms.
Okay.
Marcus, it never
But
went
you
ahead.
were aware of the S&S actually going ahead?
The initial
The
deal.
refinery, yes.
Yes, and that is why I was saying you can't let this one go
No, I
ahead when
understand.
it's,
It's just the way you
yes.
presented it, it was ambiguous. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a couple of more questions. Dr. Machila testified before the commission that you approached him to be appointed to the board of AXA, and that he refused, and that you were very unhappy with that.
Oh, was it, oh, Mr. Commissioner, now, in fact, even my fellow directors would know this about me. I had explicitly said I cannot avail myself for any board appointments because of my other commitments, which I was more committed to and I wanted to give time to. So I had said that, so ordinarily all my fellow directors sat in other boards. So I had said to them, well, between practice and the other activity linked to practice that I get involved in and which I'm more passionate about, I don't want them to be absent in board meetings. So I did not take up any other boards, literally over the period of the 4 years at the PIC. And you'll note that if you look at all the other directors, they sat in 2, 3 other boards, being PIC appointees.
That's why I'm asking you, because I've noticed that you don't have a seat on any board.
That's correct, Mr. Commissioner.
Would it be correct to say that that statement of Dr. Machila is factually incorrect?
It is factually incorrect, Mr. Commissioner. We had, in fact, that discussion. So, for example, I know Dr. Dan had specifically spoken to me about going to the V&A waterfront, and he had also spoken to me about going to another property company that we're invested in. And I told him that I could not avail myself for those. And
when you say going to, you mean being appointed.
being
to
appointed
the board
into
of the
that board, yes. And when the whole, AXA appointment came up, my name was put there, and together with one of my colleagues, Mr. Dudu Hlachwayo, and she was appointed to the board. There was never even a deliberation about it. I did not sit in the Directors' Affairs Committee, so at no point did I participate in the engagement, And because what he had said to me is that, Ms. Zulu, I think you must consider sitting in more boards. I think you can add value, etc. So you must consider it. So I said, well, at some point maybe I'll consider taking one. But for me, I did tell him that I want to then make sure that nothing clashes with my other commitment, which would take me away literally for about 6 weeks. I would not be available even to attend PIC board meetings.
While we're on this topic, can you briefly share with us your views on non-execs sitting on boards and employees of the PIC, like executive heads of listed or unlisted, sitting on boards of investee companies?
Well, Mr. Commissioner, we fortunately obtained a legal opinion to actually guide us on how we deal with these matters. And it's an opinion I do agree with, that the shareholder has the prerogative to appoint whoever they want to appoint into an investee company, including an employee or a non-executive director. But what becomes an issue is the element of confidentiality, the Chinese walls, so to speak. So, and we obtained a legal opinion to that effect. Now, my view around my colleagues sitting in various boards, I think it was good because they also added value, understanding the mission of the PIC and the strategy and what we wanted to achieve insofar as investee companies were concerned. So they had that in mind to say, when we invest in this entity, what were we trying to achieve? So does employees, so do employees. That is the benefit. But outside of that, the PIC appointed a lot of independent directors with various skills from various sectors to actually sit in those boards. But what we had resolved is that the non-executive directors of the PIC will not sit in listed companies, obviously because of, the regulatory environment, in the listed space. But especially in the unlisted space, some of those investments are risky, they're new, and we would have approved them because we see the effect, the social effect, like job creation, etc., that would come with that transaction or with that investment. But then that you have a Miss, Zulu or Hlachwayo or Manning or whoever sitting there looking, at that investment and knowing what the PIC wants to achieve out of it.
Sorry, Advocate Libber. I'm thinking of taking a short break. Can we make it 15 minutes?
Yes, Mr.
Come
Commissioner.
back at 3:30.
Thank you.
Thank you. everybody is probably stunned by the fact that only 2 of us come in when there were 3 of us when we left. Yes, Ms. Marcus has a previous arrangement. She had to excuse herself and attend to what she was supposed to attend to this afternoon.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
But we will continue
Thank you.
with
I
the
have,
evidence.
I have 2 or 3 more questions, and I have an arrangement with my witness here that the answers will be brief. Ms. Zulu, just a couple of questions about Dr. Machila again. And it's not about Dr. Machila. Would you agree that the CEO of an institution like the PIC is a very powerful man or person?
Without a doubt, Mr. Commissioner.
And even more so when that position is combined as the CIO and CEO.
That's correct.
And we have the facts, it's not in dispute, that Dr. Machila phoned Mr. Malautsi and requested him to assist a lady whose name has also been thrown about here, pretty low, and to assist her with 300,000 rand. Mr. Malautsi testified that, that is a type of request you don't say no to. How would you, in what light would you see it?
Mr. Commissioner, I'm conflicted in that matter, so I'll reserve my comments.
I accept that. But let's say he phones Mr. B and tells Mr. B, listen, there's a young woman who's in dire straits at the moment. She needs money. Can you assist her with 500,000 rand? I think what we can agree, I think it cannot be argued otherwise that it's improper.
Mr. Commissioner, I think it needs to be viewed in this manner. You have various, black business people, entrepreneurs, trying out, they want to do a deal or two, secure a tender or two, and it does not even matter what the view is or what the processes are internally. And it goes back to the perception. How does that entrepreneur trying to secure that tender from a state-owned institution or a deal, from an institution like a PIC or funding for that matter, how would they then respond to an individual that they see having the authority and power in that same institution? So it's not even a case of what do you ask for, but what message is sent when such a request is made. It could be financial, it could be do this, but in what context is it done? And that is why our view was to protect the CEO and any other member of the executive. Such engagements should happen in a formal environment, so that, you can say, this is the context and this is our policy. I've complied with the internal processes or policy, and this is basically what I require you to do if you are able to do so. Then it takes away any perception of undue influence being exerted, etc. And I think in this instance, that's where the gray area, so to speak, is.
Thank you. The last question is, I'm going to take you to the meeting with the then Minister of Finance, Mr. Gigaba, on the 13th of September 2017, where you and other board members and Dr. Machila were all present in a meeting with the then Minister of Finance. And according to Ms. Matabula's evidence under oath here, he mentioned that he received a text, a WhatsApp text, from a Cape Town businessman reading as follows. Hi Malusi, can you call me urgently? My editors have picked up a story on the removal of Dan Machilla as PIC CEO at a special board meeting on Friday. I'm not sure if you are aware, this will be catastrophic and will set us back. Please intervene to stop this, since it is not good for you and the project. I have also sent Sifiso a text. I'm available to chat anytime. And the minister responded as follows, I'm not on the PIC board, Chief. I cannot intervene on this, as it is a matter the board has not formally reported to me. My deputy has not told me they have suspended the CEO. I'm sure you would understand. I have to respect governance. To which the businessman responded, of course, I'm just trying to help so that it does not embarrass you, the deputy minister and the government. It will also undo all the good publicity you have been getting. I leave it in your hands. Can you recall the minister telling you about this WhatsApp message?
Yes, Mr. Commissioner.
I'm not asking you to try and identify the Cape businessman, but can you just briefly tell the Commission in what context did he mention that to the PIC board members?
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. The minister had called us in at the time because he was very concerned that, to use his exact words, he was being dragged into PIC board processes. And as shareholder, I think at the time he had not met with the board. We had not had any engagement with the minister. He had just met with management, just as it was an introductory meeting, which we understood to be very cordial, and he even assured management of his support. Now, he then says, well, I'm receiving various calls from the media and the public in general regarding what you, as the board, are doing, the fact that you're going to hold a meeting, the fact that you're going to fire the CEO, what is going on? Why am I being dragged into the board's business? And I think because I've tried to explain myself to the public and to some journalists that have contacted me, let us do this jointly so that the public knows, even those who may not have a clear understanding of corporate governance and what the role of the shareholder representative is. Just let's come out and tell the public, that I don't know about this meeting, and that the board has convened its normal, meeting to deal with its business and has not reported anything to me. That's what, it was in that context, he then says, it's gone as far as I'm receiving text messages. That's when he then read it on record.
Mr. Commissioner, thank you. I have no further questions.
When you say that's when he referred to the WhatsApp to the message?
Yes, to the WhatsApp message, because he was just saying he's receiving various inquiries about what's happening in our boardroom. And then he said, as an example, I received this WhatsApp message, which I'm completely clueless about.
Ms. Zulu, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yes. I've got quite a number of questions, about 10 to 12 questions. So it's quite a lot. And the first page is more generic about the board and all that. And the second page are more specific. Yeah? All right.
Thank you, Mr.
So to start off is that, how would you characterize the PIC board? Was it a management board or it was a governing board? I think it's a big question which we asked around and was still not sure in terms of the answer. Yeah, that's the first question. I think let's just go question by question.
Are we going to, should
Yeah,
I
just
list
one
all the-
question per time. Yeah, it's fine. Like if you could answer briefly, please.
So the PIC board, in my view, was a governance board. So firstly, the PIC is a state-owned entity which must comply with, you know, the PFMA and the likes, and acts as a accounting authority of the institution. But at the same time, it's the same board that then takes ultimate accountability for assets under management. So it goes back to authorities delegated to various levels, but ultimately the board, you know, takes accountability. So it is a governance board.
And mainly because it's got delegations which it has sort of pushed down, and people must act within those delegations.
That's
Is that
correct, Mr.
Yeah.
Commissioner.
So it's not a management board.
Not in my view.
It doesn't take decisions that the management must take.
It does not take decisions that management must take.
All right.
It goes back to what has been delegated. And that's why on an annual basis, or even on an ad hoc basis when the need arises, the board would then review and revise its delegations. So some delegations which may have been sitting with management the previous year, you might find that the following year the board has felt this is too risky, we are actually taking over, or is a board subcommittee must now sit with such delegations.
Some reserved matters also would, the board would take some stuff and put it in the reserved matters for the board?
That's
Does
correct.
it happen? It does happen?
Yes.
All right, okay, thank you. Next one. Just in terms of maybe the problems that were at the PIC, do you think there's been a big problem between the investment teams versus the functional teams? Because if you look at the witnesses and the evidence, there seems to be a lot of people that had a problem with Dr. Machila, and they're from risk or legal or whatever. And we haven't had witnesses from the investment team being against them and all that. Do you think there's a rift between, say, the functions and the investment section by any chance?
My view, Mr. Commissioner, is that there's no such rift per se. And I think from at least what I've observed through this commission is that you found, you know, more employees who, whether former or current, who were on the operational side being more vocal and coming out.
Yes.
But my view is that it's a representative, it could be a representation or a snippet of the general view within the institution, because if you look at the union, for example, that was formed, it's not necessarily membered by just those who are on the operational side or the corporate side, from the corporate side, but also employees from, you know, who are, you know, in assets under management, the investment teams also participate in those unions. So I think it's basically a general view, and I think it would be incorrect to actually categorize it and say it belongs to corporate or AUM, but it's an institutional issue.
Yeah, all right. And then just in terms of the CEO, Dr. Machila, the past one, is that there was a feeling that he was very powerful and that he had a hold on the board, you know. And I've asked this question to other people like Ms. Beswick and all that, but they feel that no, he was not, he didn't sort of hold them in thrall, and they were working quite fine. What is your thinking about that? Did Dr. Machila have a hold on the board?
Mr. Commissioner, I think as the board, we trusted our CEO.
Yeah.
We had faith in our CEO. And the powers and authority that was delegated to him, we left it at that. And it goes back to what I said earlier, that in hindsight, there may have been matters where we should have actually asked more questions as the board. So then that's where the perception would come from, to say, this is the board that covers for its CEO, this is the board that the CEO, has held at ransom, or whatever the case may be. But I think there was generally, a healthy relationship with our CEO, and we had a lot of faith in him, not just him, but the entire management team. But the interaction with him would be more common because he was also a director.
So, but are you saying he didn't sort of have a hold, or he sort of had it?
I don't believe he had a hold per se.
Okay.
That's why I'm saying maybe we did not question him enough. But I don't believe, I never felt, for example, at any point, I couldn't ask him questions. Maybe that's why then he even had a perception that, oh, maybe Ms. Zulu didn't like me.
Yeah.
But I mean, I hold him, in high
asked the
regards.
questions. Okay.
And we just should have asked him more questions than we did.
Yeah. All right. Next one. According to you, well, people, people feel victimized and everything. Say, if I had to ask you, who were the biggest culprits in victimizing people? Do you know? Can you venture some names? You were on the board, so I'm sure you would know.
Well, I think a lot of evidence has come out here. Like I'm saying, there was never a formal complaint given to the board to say, as employees so-and-so or the following employees are being victimized by the following executives or management. So a lot of these things were actually just basically informal, being discussed informally, where you got a sense that employees there was a sense of discomfort and fear.
Next one. Just in terms of the IC, there are proposals at the PIC, and even the other witnesses have spoken about it, that if you have a new corporate structure, that the IC shouldn't take investment decisions. What's your thinking around that? Am I clear?
Well, Mr. Commissioner, you would expect the IC to be able to make some form of decision on investment, on investments.
Yes.
And it goes back to, if you look at the current structure, there are transactions that are approved at PMC level, and then there are transactions that are approved at fund investment panel level. Then there are transactions that go to the investment committee. And I think the investment committee, if you look at its terms of reference, is to do exactly that. And the idea of having the fund investment panels reduces the load on the investment committee and delegates some authority to the fund investment panels. And it becomes, it's also sector specific. So you'd have the property investment panel, you would have the infrastructure investment panel, etc. So in the years that I've been at the PIC, those structures for me have worked.
Okay, all right. Two more broad questions, and we'll go to specifics. In terms of the chairperson of the PIC, do you think that person should be a politician? Deputy Minister of Finance?
Mr. Commissioner, my view is that whether you have a politician or not, what is important is the independence, is acting ethically and in the interest of the institution. I've had the benefit of having 3 chairpersons at the PIC, whom I believe, for example, the first, no, it's actually 4, because the first chairperson when I arrived in 2016 was former Minister Nene. He was still the deputy minister. And I saw him adding a lot of value in the board, and he would bring even the government perspective. Ultimately, these are pensioners' funds, and government is also, you know, the guarantor. So in some of the investments, just to understand, for example, what government's thinking is around infrastructure investments, for example. And he would bring in that perspective into the board. In as much as he was the chair, he never participated in any investment decisions, because at board level, very few, I think in the time I've been at the PIC, maybe 1 or 2 transactions have been to the board. But that perspective for me added value. That was the case as well with Deputy Minister, with chairperson at the time, SABC Jonas,
All right, okay,
and
no,
all
yeah,
of them,
yeah, okay.
yes.
But what about the fact that because of cabinet reshuffles, you find that then the chairperson changes, and then, you know, the PIC is a long-term investor. It needs stability in the board, you know, that the board should save 3, 5, 10 years to see the investments through.
So my experience as well at the PIC was that when there are cabinet reshuffles, the PIC committees would still sit. The board committees would still be operational, so it would be business as usual. And then the deputy chairman of the board would act as the chairperson pending the appointment of the new chairman, being the deputy minister. That's what happened. It was only in one instance where the board was actually asked to put on hold, you know, its business. But generally, over the 4 years, the board has never been directly negatively impacted by the change in ministers, because the board meetings would still take place, decisions would still be made, etc.
I can go on there, but let's drop it there and go to another question. All right? Just in
So,
terms,
Mr. Commissioner, my view is
Yes.
that either or.
Yeah.
I'm
Oh, I see, I see.
I'm not completely opposed to. I can't say I've seen disadvantages with having the deputy minister being the chairperson of the board. It has added value, you know, in some instances. So either or, I don't have an issue with it.
okay, all right. And then just in terms of skills of the board, the broad skills, and, you know, would you say which ones would be the key ones, 3, 4, 5 skills that are required on the board, the members of the board? We know there's legal, you know, we know there's...
We'll take away legal.
The
and then
HR, there's
yes.
the HR, IT
Yes. Yes,
maybe.
IT.
What else? What
So
else?
in the past, I think in the recent past, we actually saw that we needed an IT specialist to sit in the board, because ultimately the PIC is about its, you know, human resource and also its systems. And so you need a non-executive director with that skill to actually assist in overseeing the committee and chairing that committee. And then obviously we are an asset manager, so you need, you know, that strong skill in asset management, investment banking, general corporate governance, you know, because I've heard of boards where you have CAs, 10 CAs, but the companies collapse. So you generally need a vast, you know, number of skills to complement each other. And for the record, Mr. Commissioner, I think the PIC has had that skill in the years that I've been there.
Okay. All right, then I'll go to specific questions, because there's been a lot. I think Advocate Lubes asked some, but there's been a lot of specific allegations, which, you know, I want to hear your versions, you know, across the board. You are a judge, acting judge, so you need to give us...
I'm a lawyer, Mr.
is this, is that Dr. Machila has said that together with you and Dr. Mkwanazi, were in cahoots in making sure he is fired. I mean, in a nutshell, that's what he said. What do you say to that?
Well, I deny that allegation.
Okay, all right, you're gonna stop there.
I'll stop them.
You're
In
advised to stop
in
there.
the interest of time, Mr. Commissioner, I'll stop there.
You deny it
I've
completely. Yeah.
found Dr. Mkwanazi to be independent. You know, he's an experienced corporate executive. I've never had any private sessions or caucuses with him. I mean, it was unfortunate that Dr. Majila had to make such a comment because I think he's also seen in the boardroom how sometimes we would differ, you know, amongst ourselves, even between myself and Dr. Mkwanazi.
All right. And then next one is that in terms of, you know, Fidelis Madavo and Victor Siane were suspended on a draft report. There was a meeting going on the whole night, and the following morning they were given letters and all that. And I think it was Ms. Beswick. She said that you actually typed the letters. You were quite active actually in participating to make sure that these people were gone, you know. I just want to understand because they say, and this is not, there is another one where they say when this CEO was fired, you had a legal opinion ready, you typed the media statement, you typed the letter, you know, to accept this, like sort of his, sort of him resigning. I just want to understand. So the picture we got here from Beswick, from Machila and the others was that you were quite active in the board and you were doing things that the management was supposed to do. The HR that, you know, it was supposed to be Chris Polwani, and then the corporate affairs were supposed to write the media statement. So I just want to hear your version there.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I think in some of those matters, I won't get into detail because there are records and, you know, the record and transcripts will actually, you know, bear me out. But I think at a personal level, just to make the commission understand, one of the personal skills I have is that as, you know, you are deliberating, I write. So I literally just start writing my own notes, whether it's in an iPad or it's here. So if you look at some of our meetings, where remember, there was not a single individual from management because there were meetings in camera and we had a board secretary just sitting there basically recording. So what I would do when the board is busy deliberating, I would be writing and taking notes. And when my turn comes to actually, you know, make a comment, I would then say, colleagues, having heard what you said, this is what I've noted. And I would read out. So is this correct? Are we saying this is our resolution? Because at some point you need to close a matter. And then colleagues would say, no, actually, can you add this? No, we didn't say it this way. And the records are very clear. I mean, after one of my colleagues had made that comment, I asked for the transcripts, and they clearly reflect that. And we used to do it all the time. And it was not just during this period, but even previously, where certain matters would come up, and we would say, colleagues, let's prepare a draft statement and send it through. So though that is what happened. And for example, when the letters were being, you know, done, ultimately the company secretary would then put the letter on the letterhead and take the notes, you know, which I would have prepared and type, you know, the letter, notes which would include, by the way, other directors' comments. And then in a letter that needs to be signed by Chris Polwane, for example, it would be handed over to him to make sure that it includes all these other, you know, HR terms or conditions basically for a suspension. That's how it was done.
Wouldn't that job be better done by the company secretary? I would have thought they are in the meeting to do exactly what you were doing.
No, so the notes would be for myself, Mr. Commissioner.
Yes.
They would, so I would literally be writing for myself. And at the time, unfortunately, we had a very efficient board secretary. And she would ask just to be assisted to say, can you give me, the wording, is this properly captured, etc., Ms. Lowe? And we would do that because at the time, Ms. Matebula was on suspension. And she would capture those things properly and then circulate it to the board. We would read it. We would literally read it out, or she would read it out for us, and then we correct it, make the final corrections, and then say, can you then hand it over to, the necessary signatory, whether it's the HR head, etc. And the records will show that clearly, if you look at the transcripts of the meetings. So it was never Zulu's drafting and then
Yes,
that's
it's quite interesting because all of them, I mean, I've looked at 8.9 of Best Week, whatever, 895. I mean, they're saying that you actually was heavily participant, and the impression we get at the commission was that you were almost the final person to write these things, but maybe you're saying a different story.
Mr. Commissioner, may I request that for the benefit of the commission, and in the interest of time, you just go through the transcripts. For example, if you look at the transcript that where the board had been presented with the investigation report and ultimately resolved, to suspend. I mean, there was a strong view. It was a unanimous decision of the board. And the board was saying, I mean, at some point, some colleagues were saying, can't we just fire this executive head immediately? This is not his first violation. And I said, no, colleagues, let's calm down. That is the kind of engagement. So also I was as surprised when then I heard, some colleagues making certain comments. But for me, those are easily, cleared out, through
With
transcripts.
With the transcripts, okay.
Yes.
And then just in terms of the Machila firing, that they say that when the meeting was going on or so, and they wanted to get a legal opinion, you already had some case law and some opinion, and you said, this is the opinion, and there's no need to go to external counsel. That's what Best Week, or Dude, I think, yeah.
No. That's not correct, Mr. Commissioner. The colleagues were saying there was a debate on whether the letter could be regarded as a resignation letter or not. That was basically what was being debated in the boardroom. So each director was expressing a view on that matter. And once again, the recording will make that clear to say everybody was expressing, a view, on the matter. And the question was being asked, is this a resignation letter? Is this not? So everyone expressed a view, and when, my turn came, I also expressed my view, to say, well, clearly the CEO is intending to resign, so the only issue now is the when part. But this is basically a resignation letter where he's saying, I want to resign in March. And now we're at the end of November. So what the board needs to discuss is whether he leaves in March or he leaves immediately. And the record will show that.
And then just in terms of the bad lender and I think it's Lukubo, Nemagovani. In terms of the investigation of Dr. Machila and More, they say that he says that he was cleared almost twice, with the bad lender the second time, and then with the MST, sort of he was cleared also. But I think by the board, but I think you and Dr. Mkwanazi and the other people insisted that this has got to go on, and that millions of rands were spent on something which could have been dealt with very quickly, you know. And he did mention about you that you were not happy, you wanted to open the whole thing again and again.
So, Mr. Commissioner, once again, that's not correct. And the records are clear. What happened was the board took a decision. And when the board was taking that decision, when the decision was taken, my dissenting view was recorded as, you know, per the norm. That's what happened. The matter was closed.
Was closed then, yes.
The matter
yes.
was closed then. The matter was closed. The only time the matter was reopened was when Minister Nene wanted answers. We then were served with court papers, and ultimately Minister Nene issued a directive to the board. So the matter was closed in 2017. That's what led to the matter not being closed publicly. That's how it ended up creating excitement, because the board had said, this is our decision, and that's it. So even when we met with Minister Kigaba, he was told, this is the board decision, and that was it. We met with Minister Nene, we told him, this is the board decision, and we stand by it. And after having that session with him, he then wrote and said, I'm not happy with your decision, and I am hereby directing you to reopen the matter. So the investigation was not instituted by the board. It was actually instituted by the minister through the board. So it was a directive saying, I want you to investigate. Hence, when the report came out, it was handed over to the minister, because by then, the board had already expressed itself on the matter.
Okay. Yeah. And then tell me then, so why was that reported, the bad lender report? Why was it not released to the media and to other people? Because Dr. Machila said that report was there, but for months or weeks, I don't know, for months actually, it was kept under lock and key.
No.
And his reputation was suffering and all that.
So what happened, Mr. Commissioner, the report was actually sent to the minister,
yeah,
with the request that he then guides the board on how to deal with the report. Yes. Because the report even had findings on the board, by the way. There were certain findings that Advocate Butlender had made on the conduct of the board. Now, we needed as the board to be guided by the owner of the report on how we go about implementing the recommendations. And I think the minister must have left at some point, and the matter was never properly concluded, but the board took a resolution to say, now that we've received the report, we'll take it to the minister and say, as per your directive, this is the report, then can you guide us on how we deal with matters that arise from this report?
And did the minister guide the board, or did that report stay for a year or a year and a half in the drawers?
Well, I think Minister Nene then left at some point, and then obviously you must take the matters forward with the new minister, etc. But I don't remember us engaging, on matters that had arisen, because I know personally I was quite concerned on some of the findings that were made against the board itself.
Chair, can I perhaps assist? The report was a Treasury report, and when the Commission started with its sittings, I requested Treasury to have the report handed over to the Commission and be published. That's how it happened.
All right, thanks. Yeah, I think it's clearer now. Okay, so it was not a board report.
It was not a board
It was a
report.
Treasury report.
That's correct.
That's clear. That's clearer now. Next one, just in terms of the affidavit that the chairperson in the Holomisa matter signed, and, there was a board decision taken, and he didn't agree. Do you think he was right to dissent and to actually file that affidavit to say he supported the suspension of the CEO? Do you think, a board takes a decision and someone in a court of law, changes and goes a different route in terms of corporate governance? I know you addressed it earlier.
Mr. Commissioner, I think the content of that affidavit is very critical, because nowhere does it say that the chairperson supported the suspension of the CEO. That affidavit, if I remember correctly, it basically said, I've come in as the chairman of the board, I've now been cited as a respondent in this matter, and these are my views on these allegations. I will then abide by the decision of the court, and he left it at that. And I think that's very important to highlight, because even the board itself did not oppose the entire application. The board only opposed specific prayers in that application. So we said we will stay out of certain matters. The court must make a determination, but on matters that affect us as directors, that raise questions about us acting in good faith, with skill and care, we wanted to respond to those matters. So even our affidavit was very narrow. Just like the minister dealt with matters that related to him, where he said, well, the court must give me an opportunity to deal with my board as the shareholder representative. He did not get into what had happened in the boardroom, and he said, all I'm asking for is that I've now taken action, and I'm considering these matters, and I'm going to direct the board accordingly. The CEO also opposed the fact, the prayer that he must be suspended, and so each party dealt with matters, that related to it. But it was not basically in direct agreement that, yes, fire this board or suspend this board or whatever. It was nothing like that, or suspend the CEO.
Okay, all right. Just in terms of the divisions that you mentioned in the board, I've asked before, and apparently there were two factions, and tell me if it's sort of right or wrong that there were 6 or 7 or 8 people in one faction, and there was you and Dr. Mkwanazi and the chairperson in the other. Is that correct? Is that in terms of how the battle lines were drawn?
Mr. Commissioner, in my everyday job, you are on the opposing side with someone, with a colleague. The following day, you are literally working together, opposing someone else. And I think for me, I've had a serious struggle to identify with the so-called factions, because I've had times where I've opposed Chairman Gugubele. I've told him outright I do not agree with his views, and I've given reasons. And I've actually, been on the side of whether it's Ms. Hlachwayo or Ms. Beswick, and so for me it has been issues-based, and therefore what my view on the matter would be. I've never seen it as factions. We don't know each other outside of the PIC. We're there as professionals, and I wanted to believe that we acted as professionals.
So you never sided in one group all the time, their point of views? And
Not at all.
Yeah. All right.
So, for example, there was even a view that the board was divided on certain matters. So, for example, with regards to the CEO's resignation, it was a unanimous decision by the board to say we must accept this resignation. It was a unanimous decision. The only issue was then there were 2 or 3 members who were saying, let's accept his terms. And the majority of the board, which included, directors who are said to be in other factions, were saying, well, the letter is concerning what the CEO has said in the letter is concerning, he raises issues of trust, etc., how the board has treated him, and the board was clearly uncomfortable with some of the allegations that the CEO had raised. And hence the board then said, let us thank him and say that we will allow for him to actually leave 3 months earlier than the terms that he was dictating to the board.
The final question here, then so some comments there. We spoke about Fidelis Madavo and Victor Siani, and you seem to say there was a bit of process followed and all that. On the one hand, there was some findings on Matebola and Menye, and you say that that's fine and all that, So I'm trying, and, Dr. Machila said you and Ms. Matebola had a good relationship, so you used to meet, that's what he said, that you were meeting. So how do you sort of reconcile those two, in a sense that on the one hand, there was a process, but there was a draft report with Madavo and Siani. On the other hand, with Menye and Matebola, there were findings, with Matebola, So how do you sort of reconcile your stance on those two issues and all that?
So firstly, Mr. Commissioner, with regards to Matebola and Menye, there were no findings. There was a forensic investigation and the report was inconclusive.
Okay. All right.
Then they were taken through a disciplinary process. A hearing, the chairperson of a hearing recommends to an employer, whether they say final warning or whatever the case may be.
They recommend.
It's a recommendation.
It's a recommendation, okay.
And the employer is not bound by that recommendation. So the chairperson of a hearing can say it's a good guide, and in most cases it would be accepted. And he could say, well, I think this employee must get a final warning, and the employer can say, well, actually we want a dismissal here. The transgression is serious enough for a dismissal. And so the board, as the employer, exercised its authority on the matter, and we concluded it. And my view is that we acted, in good faith and in the interest of the institution, because we took into account all the other factors, including a report which was inconclusive, and how these disciplinary hearing had emanated. Same goes with the Madavu process. The board was presented with a report which it fully considered, and we deliberated on it. Like I was making an example now, in that meeting there was even a strong view by some directors that why are we wasting time? And we had to actually correct those matters to say, well, let's follow process. But it was clear to us, and it must be highlighted, Mr. Commissioner, that the reason for the suspension was not necessarily just the transgression, but it was the allegations in the report which were saying the said employees were not fully cooperating, not disclosing information, and therefore could actually interfere with the investigation. And that was the basis of the board saying, place them on, because remember, there were a number of employees who were also implicated in the report. But at the time, the board, after looking at the report, unanimously resolved for those 2 employees to be suspended.
And the board, in terms of all those 4 cases, did the board have the powers or the delegations or whatever to do that, or was that area for management?
So it goes back, Mr. Commissioner, to what I was saying, that the board has the ultimate authority. But in terms of the PIC's delegations, the CEO would would suspend, take a decision to suspend. But if you remember at the time, the acting CEO was implicated, and she had correctly written to the board herself to ask to be recused from those processes because she knew that her name had been mentioned and she had participated somehow in the transaction. Now, when the CEO is removed, then the board had to make decisions. Hence, the executive head of HR could not have gotten instructions from the CEO, but had to get instructions directly from the board to say the board has accordingly resolved to suspend the following employees, now implement the decision of the board.
Did it happen for both sides in terms of the first part of Madavo and Siani and the second part of Menye and Matebula? Did the CEO say, take the powers for now because I'm conflicted, or I can't
Well,
act?
in the Menye, as you would already know, Mr. Commissioner, in the Menye and Matebula matter, the board only got involved now in 2019. Before then, it was strictly management through the CEO that was making decisions. Hence, for example, we learned about the settlement agreement and the processes, ex post facto, but we still tried to rectify those matters. But insofar as these were concerned, the investigation had been initiated by the board, the report was presented to the board in camera, the board resolved on what action should be taken insofar as the content of and the findings of the report is concerned, and that's when the decision to suspend and take further action was taken by the board.
Then the that's the final question there is, just in terms of the leaks and the IT issues and all that, do you think that the actions taken by the CEO, CFO, Mr. Polwane, were they justified? I mean, this is our terms of reference. Were they justified?
Mr. Commissioner, in hindsight, the board we should have considered the fact that the CEO is actually implicated in some of these matters that have come up. So as part of, managing conflict, we should have actually excused the CEO from participating in that process for his own protection and for the integrity of the process, and then allowed or designated some directors, which we always do. We would have a task team, an ad hoc committee, which has directors, and they deal with matters that we are of the view that management can't deal with. And I think there we may have erred. We should have allowed for the process to actually happen at the board level to protect both the CEO and the CFO.
Yes, because he said, when he was asked, he said he could do it because he was cleared, you see. Was he cleared? I mean,
Well,
by the board, he said, when we asked him, but you were conflicted, so, I mean, how could you carry out the process? He said, no, he could because by then he was cleared.
he had been cleared by the
By the
board,
board,
that's
yes.
correct. And the board had gone as far as saying any other allegations must not be investigated. And that's a decision that the minister ultimately overturned. But I think because remember, these matters were already in the public. And in as much as we had cleared the CEO, they kept, coming up. We should have actually, for the integrity of the process, have said we remove the CEO and allow for the process to be independent.
Yes, finally. So just the, on the leaks still is that, do you think that there was a process that, it appears that people were quite frustrated in the PIC and some wanted to make sure that things get heard and all that. And maybe the whistleblowing policy, they felt it was not the best policy or whatever. do you think the way it was approached was the last straw? You know, people felt powerless and they said, let's do leaks and get them to the media, or do you think there could have been other ways to deal with these issues?
Well, Mr. Commissioner, there certainly could have been other ways, you know, to deal with these matters and express frustration. But at the same time, I think we need to take responsibility as the board that perhaps the culture that was already there didn't inspire confidence with our employees that should they raise some of these matters, they will still be protected. And I think we should have actually done more work just to deal with that, because that's really the issue. You have a whistleblowing policy, but then they say, oh, well, yes, it goes through whatever internal audit, and internal audit must report it to the CEO. So how do we actually... Yes, and the audit committee,
yes.
you know, the audit committee and some of the directors are said to be covering, you know, for the CEO. So I think we should have then put systems in place to assure our employees to say you can still trust the system. You can still be able to express your concerns, your views, your frustrations, and you will be protected. That will not jeopardize, you know, your employment.
So are you saying that there could have been a way where the employees could have taken these matters to the board without worrying, you know, to the chairperson, deputy chairperson, or a task team of the board, and take these issues without a worry?
Well, there was no such platform. And remember, in an environment of, you know, fear, whether it's perceived or real, you know, when you are not certain, when you don't know what's going on, you know, any decision you make, you don't know if you should do it or if you shouldn't do it. And I think we should have actually taken more steps to rectify, you know, those matters. So that is why, for example, I don't necessarily dislike Mr. you know, James Nogu, save for the fact that he's just delayed and messed up one's career. But generally, if there could have been issues that were raised there that needed to be looked into, investigated, then you allow for that. What if it was an employee so frustrated and thinking, oh, Ms. Zulu and other directors are corrupt and they're busy approving deals and they're getting billions from the PIC, and it was genuine, and they don't trust the whistleblowing system. They can't go to the chairperson of the board or any other directors, because those are my colleagues and they would alert me. So that's why the board needs to actually formulate a system where employees, or in fact any other party, even external stakeholders, are able to blow the whistle and know that those matters will be properly attended to.
Yes, all right, okay. Yeah, so I wanted to ask who's James Nogu, but I think you're not going to give me something there. Is there something you want to say, maybe, on who James Nogu is? Any ideas?
I'd love to have tea with him.
Really?
Advocate Lube says I will kill him.
Anything you want to venture there? No?
No, none whatsoever.
All right.
I think, Mr. Commissioner, that is why my view was, we can't even focus on who this individual is. Let's deal with the
issues.
allegations.
Yeah.
Because once you deal with the allegations and you know that, you know, if they're unfounded, you're able to clear individuals and you move on, you know, because, you know, as I was preparing the statement, I was like, do I refer to him as Nogu or Nogu or Noko, you know? So you don't know if it's various parties or one individual.
Yes. All right, yeah, thanks. I think I'm done. Yeah, thank you very much. I had questions, but I wanted to hear your version. You know. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
You're not done yet.
Yeah. From my side, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
I'm going to ask one or two questions. The first one is, there's a small discrepancy that I'd like cleared in the lifestyle report. I don't want to raise it here. I'd rather send that discrepancy to you through Advocate Libba. Would you be prepared to send us an affidavit in that regard?
Or even immediately after the session, if you would want it done in camera, Mr. Commissioner, I would be prepared to do so.
Okay, we'll talk about it after
Yes.
I've finished. What was or let me start with the letters of suspension. I'm not sure that I got your answer. Did you or did you not personally write these letters of suspension to Madavu and Siane?
The letters of suspension were dictated, the company secretary was there, so it's not like I was typing the letters. So we had written notes because we said the board by then had taken a resolution that these are the reasons why these individuals are going to be suspended. So I wrote those matters down, and then the company secretary typed that, and then the HR executive was called, and he was then given the content because he had not seen the report, the internal audit report, and was not aware what the board resolution was. But he was given the reasons why the board wants to suspend. Then after that, he completed, because a suspension letter would have certain conditions you can't so he put that part. But in terms of the content and the reasons why the employees were being suspended, that content was given to him through the company secretary, who sent it to him, and then he put it on the letterhead. So if you look at the record, Mr. Commissioner, you will see it is the entire board engaging. So the initial part, because we had said, okay, colleagues, what are the reasons for, suspending? And then, are these the reasons? And colleagues would say, yes, this is correct. No, actually, we must include this. And then we'd agree, no, let us not include that. It's a simple suspension letter. So you'll pick that up on the record, that the entire board is engaging around those matters to say, how much content do we put in the letter? Let us leave it at that. And then it's handed over to HR.
Thank you. What was the intention of the board? What was supposed to happen after the letters were issued, letters of suspension were issued?
So the board, then the letters were given to the HR executive to finalize, and they were sent to the relevant employees. One of the directors then raised the issue. No, if I remember correctly, it was actually the board secretary who then said, I need to actually remind the board that Mr. Madavu is appearing, at the commission tomorrow. He's being called, and he's just basically going like all the other executives. So he's going there just to give background on his work, etc., and the listed unit. Then we said, what must happen? We then called in the CEO, the acting CEO, to say, please formally write to the commission to actually inform them of the decision that the board had taken, and also so that the commission is not taken by surprise, because these things have a way of leaking. But insofar as the suspension is concerned, one of the conditions is that an employee will avail themselves when they're required by the employer. And therefore, him going to the commission the following day was part of, him fulfilling his responsibility as an employee of the PIC. So that's basically what happened. And I understand that a letter was written to the commission to actually, inform it of the decision that the board had taken.
Was the intention that he be charged at some or they be charged at some stage, Madabu and Siani?
Yes, they were charged, Mr. Commissioner. They were charged. My understanding is that the hearings are ongoing. They were charged a couple of months ago, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
They
all
were
right.
charged.
Okay, thank you for that information. In your statement, at paragraph 9, say something to the effect that sadly what was to be a month, this is now with regard to investigations. Am I correct?
Yes, Mr. Commissioner.
Investigations of the allegations against who?
So the James Nogu. So the background there, Mr. Commissioner, is that when the report, as I stated in my statement, that when we got these allegations, the board held a meeting, and it was resolved that just like the Butlender process, will follow the same process, so that an investigation, the implicated directors are subjected to that independent process, and then, the report and the investigation is concluded. And because we were aware at the time that there was this commission of inquiry, and it was looking into matters of impropriety, we were going to hand over the report to it and to the minister as well. What then happened was an engagement took place between the board and the commission to say, instead of the board doing an independent process through, a forensic investigation and another senior counsel being appointed to investigate these allegations, why don't we hand over the investigation to the commission? And we were quite comfortable with that. And we were kept abreast, Mr. Commissioner, to say, well, the investigation is still going on, and then information was being requested, etc. So we were kept abreast on the developments. I think at the time we just thought it would be an investigation that would take a month or two and be concluded. We felt it was critical for it to actually happen like that.
Yes, my concern was in the second line where you say that the investigation has now been handed over to the commission at its request. Was that from communication between you and the investigation team, or your board and the investigation team?
Yes, that's correct. That's correct, Mr. Commissioner. We had after the board resolved to conduct an investigation independently, we were then informed that the commission has approached the board to say, let this investigation be handed over. Then there was actually a telecon between ourselves where we accepted and we agreed as the board that we would like to hand this process over to the commission.
I think, Mr. Commissioner, just to set the record straight, we offered to assist, and that offer was accepted.
Yes.
Thank you. You mentioned that you got a legal opinion in respect of Ms. Manya's settlement agreement. Am I correct?
Yes, Mr. Commissioner.
Can I ask Advocate Libber, do you have a copy
It has
of
been
that?
made available. Thank you, Mr.
It has been made available.
Yes.
We'd like to have copies of
Yes.
that, please. But was there any legal opinion in respect of Ms. Matebula?
With Ms. Manya, the only issue that we were looking at was the settlement agreement. And we needed to, because when we looked at the settlement agreement as the board, we were uncomfortable with some of the terms in that agreement. That's when we then said, let us be guided on how, because remember there had already been a payout in that matter. And so we wanted to be guided on how best we implement the board resolution, which was to reinstate Ms. Manya. but there was this issue that a settlement agreement had been entered into and an amount had been paid. So we understood, that there could be PFMA challenges around us just reinstating her, and then do we get the money back? Do we let her keep the money? Do we, those are all the questions that we did not have immediate responses to as the board, and we said, let us rather be guided on how we then deal with the settlement amount. That's why we then asked for, so the opinion focuses on solely the agreement and the payout made.
I take it your answer with Matebula is that no, we didn't get a legal opinion, but we discussed it and decided.
Yes, that's
on,
correct.
On what to do.
That's correct, Mr. Commissioner.
Yes. Okay. In respect of the memorandum of incorporation, which one were you operating under? There's the one in my file signed by Minister Gordon in 2012 or 13, but there was talk about other memorandums. Which one were you operating under, if you can remember?
Well, there was at some point, Commissioner, an attempt to amend the memorandum of incorporation. So we initially operated under the one signed by Minister Gordon, and then after that, there was a process to amend the MOI. And because, remember, at some point there were amalgamation, of positions, specifically that of the CIO and the CEO, etc. And so those needed to go through the amendments. I know at some point there was even a discussion around amending the term of the board to say the board can serve 3 terms rather than 2 terms. So there was that discussion. But I think at some point there was the MOI was filed and it was recalled, and I think we reverted back to the old position on the basis that there must be a proper discussion around the MOI itself and understand the organizational structure, because that's what it impacted, on. So we operated under the 2012 MOI, hence there was a discussion to say we need to reinstate the position of the CIO.
But that position had already been done away with by that time, and I'd like to know how that happened, or whether the board knew that there was that move to change the MOI and do away with the position of MOI, CIO, and I think is it the COO?
That's correct, Mr. Commissioner. So there was obviously, there were deliberations on the amendments of the MOI. So the minute the minister approved the organizational structure, I know this was when we had just joined the PIC, because that's when the position of the CIO was done away with, and Dr. Machila was appointed as the CEO. But there had been a discussion to amend the MOI, and the ultimate signatory is the shareholder representative. But that was never then finalized. Hence, when we looked back, in fact, even the GPF raised concerns to say this, they believe the position of the CIO must be reinstated. And it was not even going to be, it was not going to call for an amendment of the MOI. It was just going to call for the position to be reinstated within, within the structure, but also, and importantly, redefine the roles, because the powers and the job description of the CIO was now sitting with the CEO, and some of the functions were also sitting with the executive heads. So there was a lacuna then. So if you then reinstate the position of the CIO, you need to basically say, where do you take the powers from or the functions from in order to reinstate that position? Because previously the executive heads were just senior managers.
Yeah, why I'm asking is because I was a bit worried that the board carried on with the business of the PIC, probably knowing that the MOI requires a CIO and there is no CIO.
That's correct.
Yes. And that carried on with your knowledge, with the board's knowledge.
That's correct, Mr. Commissioner. The discussion of actually reinstating the position of the CIO is, if I remember correctly, like almost a year old. So that it had been an ongoing discussion, because initially it was the amendment of the MOI to address what was already approved, and then that ended, that did not happen. And then at some point there was a discussion of, about reinstating, and it was just never implemented. And I know that the decision that the board took was that HR, together with management, must actually assist us in redefining the functions of the CIO.
Okay. One last matter. What happened to what was due to Dr. Dan Machila when he left?
So, Mr. Commissioner, when Dr. Machila left, the amounts that the board was authorized to pay to him were paid to him. Then the amounts that require the shareholder to approve were not paid to him, just like all the other, executives. So it was not just him. In fact, the board, I think at the beginning of the year, went as far as taking a resolution that we need to actually consider that in as much as Dr. Machila had left the PIC, had already left the PIC, whenever the shareholder approves LTI or the balance of the bonuses due to the executives, it must be considered that at the time he left, he was already entitled to such amounts. So that decision was taken by the board. So when the shareholder approves it, that resolution is there to say, in fact, it was not just Dr. Machila, it was also Mervyn, yes, Mr. Miller, where we took that decision because he had made it clear that he wanted to leave the institution, but he didn't want to leave and then, lose his bonus.
So the place to go to is then the shareholder.
Yes, according to the compact, the place to go is obviously the shareholder. But generally, my view, Mr. Commissioner, is that those matters should be resolved at employer level, at board level concluded, because you would have assessed the performance of the employees, you would have, they've been scored. There's a process that actually takes place, and then they are given what's due to them. Because it's led to employees being demotivated to an extent, because they feel, well, we work for the largest asset manager in the continent, but our bonuses must be decided by a shareholder who will take into account what's happening, in others, SOEs, etc. So there had always been that issue, which I think perhaps going forward, the board must be empowered to conclude those matters.
So do I hear you correctly that the board of the PIC, your board of course didn't do it, should press the shareholder to fork out, as it were.
Well, it's not even about pressing the shareholder, but it's empowering the board to make the decision rather than it going to the shareholder. Because the board would have taken into account all the factors.
Say this is what is due to him.
Yes, and say this is what is due to you and make the final decision on the matter and then pay out. So it shouldn't actually wait for the shareholder approval, but rather, ideally, my view is that the shareholder must be notified that this is the decision the board has taken. So the final approval should actually sit with the board.
Yeah. Just one quick question there. Just in terms of the PIC sort of moving forward and to heal and all that, given that it's been a very bruising, the past 2 years or so, with different sites and everything, it's been quite bruising and all, and the commission is here, it's been so much complexity. How do you think the PIC can recover and heal, given that you are on the board? What's your thinking there, going forward? The culture, will the people gel together? How can the PIC heal?
Well, Mr. Commissioner, I think in the past few months, one had started witnessing certain steps, actions, which were meant to heal, those wounds, so to speak. And I think the new board, which I view as being more than capable to take the PIC forward, will prioritize, on those matters to say, how do we actually listen to the employees more? How do we give the employees an opportunity to voice out whatever issues they may have and assure them that we are there as the board to address those matters? I think it's continuous. When trust has been tainted, when a culture of fear has, intercepted an institution, it takes time just to, in fact, in any relationship, even, including an employment relationship, it takes time to actually assure employees to say you are in the right place of employment and you can still grow and you have a role to play. And I think that is ongoing work by the board.
Thanks. I'm done.
Edward Leber, anything further?
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. No, that concludes the business of the day. If we can start tomorrow at 9:30.
Yes, but can we arrange that?
Yeah, we'll arrange that request that you mentioned.
Just after the sitting. May I ask? That's probably what they arranged. Ms. Zulu, behind you is a man and a lady. Is that your mother?
Yes.
Father there? Oh, okay. From KZN, you guys travel there?
Yes.
All right. Okay.
In thanking you, I want to thank them as well to come up here to give you support, as I suppose they were expected to. But thank you very much. Convey our thanks to them as well.
Thank you.
We thank you. We needed your testimony because there were many gaps in the evidence that we have been given thus far, and your testimony has assisted us. Of course, as a former acting judge, you know what the position is. We are still going to make findings, and whether or not we find against you, that is the name of the game. I said yesterday to Dr. Machila, or when he finished his testimony, that we certainly wouldn't crucify anyone, but we'll make findings according to the facts that have been placed before us. you've helped us with the facts that you've placed before us, but we still have to consider it together with the other facts that, when I say it, I mean the testimony.
Yes.
Consider that testimony with the testimonies of other people that testified before us. Otherwise, thank you very much. And if we have caused you any inconvenience, we apologize for that.
Thank you, Mr.
All right.
Commissioner.
Thank you. We shall then adjourn until 9:30 tomorrow morning.